Earlier on our channel, we did a video about the age at which NFL players peak and stop getting better that used Pro Football Reference's Approximate Value metric. Our dataset also has player position captured as a variable, so now we're doing a deep dive to determine which position group is most valuable and whether that has changed over time. Quick teaser, the second answer is a clear yes. Here's a quick recap of the Approximate Value metric. Approximate Value was created and evolved by Pro Football Reference founder Drug Drynen to put a single number on the seasonal performance for any player at any position for any year. In other words, a center on the offensive line can be scored using the same metric as the quarterback that he hikes the ball to, like in the Pittsburgh Steelers 2014 season where Maurkice Pouncey had an approximate value of 15, hiking the ball to Ben Roethlisberger who had a score of 16. AV scores range from 0 to 26 in our dataset. Tom Brady does not have the number one score. LaDainian Tomlinson's 2006 season does. Some other noteworthy recent scores are Aaron Donald's 2020 season and Patrick Mahomes' 2018 season. Some other quick housekeeping notes. Our dataset has 95,169 player seasons. We stuck to the Super Bowl era. All AV scores are included, including those who had 0. And the average value among all 95,000 players in our dataset is 3.65, which we'll use as a benchmark. Pro Football Reference has over 50 unique position codes, which we grouped into 5 offensive, 3 defensive, and 3 special teams position groups. Now would be a good time to mentally lock in your prediction about which of these 11 unique groups are most valuable in the entire 58-year Super Bowl era. To read the data visualization, the average approximate value for a position group is the big purple number. When you see an n equals number in parentheses, that means the count of seasons for that position group. The thickness of the bars is proportional to that number of player seasons to give you a visual appreciation of the prominence. Green means above the average AV among all position groups, which was 3.65, and red means below the average. Okay, time for the first big reveal. The number one position group is probably not surprising. It's quarterbacks. But that has historically not always been the case. More on that in a moment. Right up there with quarterbacks are offensive linemen, followed by defensive linemen and linebackers. You'll notice the rest of the position groups below these first 4 groups have below average AV scores. So if you're an NFL general manager, you might want to build your team around these first 4 position groups. After linebackers are defensive backs, wide receivers, running backs, kickers, punters, tight ends, and long snappers. Here's an alternative view of the same data. Here AV is plotted on the y-axis and the number of player seasons is on the x-axis. The size of the circles is proportional to the number of player seasons, and the red and green color again denotes being above and below the overall AV average of 3.65. The key insights here are about scale. Teams need a lot of players at these 3 very important position groups, and a lot of defensive backs also. So the challenge for scouting and personnel departments is not just finding good players at these position groups, it's about finding a lot of good players to fill the many positions, especially on defense where players are rotated to stay fresh and for different defensive strategies. A notable factor at play in this analysis is player count inflation. Today, in 2024, teams can dress 48 players on game day and can have a practice squad of 16 players. Back in the early Super Bowl era years, teams could only dress 40 players, and early variations of the practice squad were limited to 7 players. This is effectively a 36% increase in the number of NFL players on rosters in the 58-year span of the Super Bowl era. This creates declining average AV values by decade, reflecting more players chasing the same finite game performance statistics. This means dilution, hence the declining AV scores over the decades. Now let's scroll through the counts of player seasons by position across the Super Bowl era decades. Quarterback counts have been relatively steady. Offensive line counts have grown. Defensive line has grown even more. Linebackers are up. Defensive backs are up a lot. Wide receivers are up. Running back counts are generally flat, as are kickers and punters. Tight end counts are up, and it looks like having a dedicated long snapper position is a relatively recent phenomenon starting in the 1990s. Now let's scroll through the actual AV scores by decade and position, remembering the position groups that had increasing counts of player seasons by decade, which serves as a headwind to having good scores because of the dilution of the finite amount of performance-related stats across more players. Quarterback AV numbers have increased, and remember their counts were generally steady through the decades, so it's safe to conclude that the quarterback importance has increased in the past 7 decades, which makes sense for the offense-oriented modern NFL. Remember, offensive linemen had increasing counts, so them having relatively stable AV suggests their importance has grown. Defensive lineman AV numbers have decreased, but that's probably due to dilution because, remember, their counts have increased significantly. Linebacker AV numbers have decreased, and their counts have not increased as dramatically as defensive line and defensive backs. So some of this might be a real decline in the importance of linebackers. Defensive backs' AV scores have gone down, but I guess this is mostly due to dilution because of the almost doubling in player counts between the 1970s and 2010s. Wide receiver AV scores are about flat in an increasing count environment, so this might suggest mildly increased importance. Running back counts were generally flat, and their AV scores are trending down, which suggests decreased importance in the modern game, which matches conventional wisdom. The rest of the positions are generally flat and not that meaningful to the overall story, which suggests that offensive linemen, quarterbacks, and wide receivers have become more important, and linebackers and running backs have become less important. The eyeballing of the AV score profiles by position and decade that we just did was not a very precise way of assessing the position groups that have become more or less important over the decades as measured by approximate value. But if we combine the 1960s with the 1970s and the 2010s with the 2020s, then we get equal time length buckets of 14 years on either end, which makes for a clean comparison. If we then look at the rankings of the position groups for both time periods and simply count the number of places that the position groups went up or down, then we can get a more official read on what went up and down in importance. When the dust settles, quarterback has grown the most in importance, along with wide receivers, punters, linebackers, and kickers. Defensive linemen and defensive backs have declined the most in importance, along with running backs. Tight ends and offensive line importance is unchanged, which is a bit of a cosmic coincidence since those men in the trenches blocking selflessly for others are often admired for their steadiness. If you've enjoyed this video, now would be a good time to subscribe, like, and sign up for notifications if you choose. These things really do help the channel and help other stat heads discover our videos. Now let's end with some closing thoughts. As always, thanks for watching. So what did I personally learn by doing this analysis and making this video? My biggest aha moments were related to the player count inflation and corresponding approximate value score reduction due to dilution. Everything about the NFL is bigger now. More games, more teams, more countries, and more players. So it's great to know going forward that this statistics dilution dynamic may exist in analyses like this. Otherwise, the results, except for tight ends being so low in relative importance, makes total sense. Quarterbacks are the most important position group in the post-Super Bowl era modern NFL history and have experienced the greatest rise in importance over those 7 decades. Along with that, other offensive positions like wide receivers and kickers, and even punters to a certain extent who play the field position game within the game, also rose in importance in this increasingly offense-oriented modern NFL game. As a person who loves defense, it was nice to see data that made me reminisce about the old days when defensive linemen and defensive backs and linebackers were more important than quarterbacks. Going forward, I may explore the tight end results in more detail. They seem to be very important in the modern game, so I was surprised that their relative importance was not closer to offensive line and wide receivers who were higher on the list. But that's what's fun about stuff like this. Getting answers leads to fun new questions, so potentially I'll see you on this topic again.